Okay, this is part 2 of the Saint Denis discussion, and kind of a good place to break. So we're on about page 382. Jean Valjean suspects nothing of Marius and Cosette's relationship. Eponine shows up again. She just keeps trying to connect with Marius in that part, and he is not interested, of course, at all, but really, like, hardly gives her the time of day, hardly speaks to her. So it's to me, it's heartbreaking how Eponine loves him and it's not returned. But of course, that is life as well. On the top of 386, Cosette tells Marius, "My father told me this morning to hold myself in readiness, that he has business, and that perhaps we should go away." And so this is bad news. He does not want to lose her again. We're not told at this point why they're leaving exactly, but that conversation has been had. And so Marius wants to do something. And he needs money in order to marry Cosette. In this day and age, women in Cosette's position did not go out and work. They were expected to be provided for by their husband. And so Marius has no money. And so he goes to his grandfather to ask permission to marry. And part of it is the money. And part of it might also be tradition, that when you agreed to marry someone, it's like the whole family had to agree because you were taking on that other family. You were going to be connected. That happens today, but not in this extreme because maybe because families are more financially independent. The Gillenormands have a lot of money. And so when they bring someone into their family, they're going to be sharing their fortune. So Marius goes to his grandfather. It's been 4 years since they've talked to each other or seen each other. His grandfather is thrilled to see him. And he asks, what is it you come here for? I come to ask your permission to marry. On page 394, the grandfather has a pretty typical response. He starts to ask him questions about the marriage. Then I understand the girl is rich, as I am, and Marius is not. What, no dowry? She's not coming with anything? She's not bringing anything financial to the marriage? No. And what is the father? Meaning, who is her father? What does he do? What's he about? His name is Fauchelevent. Fascia what? I've never heard of these people. So the response is not good from the grandfather. He's very skeptical. Marius on the bottom of page 394 says, I supplicate you. I'm begging you. I conjure you. In the name of heaven, with clasped hands, monsieur, I throw myself at your feet. Allow me to marry her. He's begging. On 395, Gillenormand says, never. Father! Now, we have not heard Marius call his grandfather father throughout the entire book, so this might be a little manipulative in trying to get what he wants. He's very desperate. Never. It was that single word father dropped by Marius which had caused this revolution. The revolution being the grandfather softens a little bit. He starts to ask more questions and talk about this girl. But what he proposes to Marius is very offensive. He says, you should just keep her as your mistress, meaning don't marry her. Marry someone else who's rich and could bring something to the family. Just keep this girl on the side. He says on the bottom of 396, pretty women are pretty women. I have been young. You will be old. Stupid. Make her your mistress. He thinks they're like two guys talking to each other, like they both will understand this concept. Marius blows up because this is the woman he loves. He would never make her his mistress. He wants to marry her. And so he stomps out. And Gillenormand immediately understands his mistake. Oh my God, this time he will not come back. So he realizes that he said the wrong thing at the wrong time, and he's regretful. On the bottom of 398, we find out why Jean Valjean would make them move again. He had seen Thénardier. He sees Thénardier out in the streets. Thénardier tried to kill him. He might very well come after him again. The police have become very active and very secret. Now, the police are probably responding to this revolution that's brewing, and that's why they're out and about more and like looking for information. But Jean Valjean is a bit paranoid about everyone coming after him. And then he goes to the garden, and on the bottom of 399, it says the garden had been violated and some person unknown had penetrated into it. And then he sees this address that Marius has scratched into one of the walls of where he will be in case Cosette needs him. And then he was about to turn around when a folded paper fell upon his knees as if a hand had dropped it from above his head. He took the paper, unfolded it, and read on it this word written in large letters with a pencil: remove. To us, that would probably be move or get out. So we are not told who drops the letter. Most of my students think it is Eponine, that Eponine is trying to get them to move on so that she could have her chance with Marius. Jean Valjean takes it as a threat, and so he is ready to move. Then Marius goes back to the garden after he sees his grandfather, and there is a voice which appears to come from the street and which cried through the trees. Now the house is empty. Jean Valjean and Cosette are gone. Monsieur Marius, he arose. Hey, said he. Monsieur Marius, is it you? Yes. Monsieur Marius, added the voice, your friends are expecting you at the barricade in the Rue de la Chanvrerie. The voice was not entirely unknown to him. It resembled the harsh and roughened voice of Eponine. Marius ran to the grating, pushed aside the movable bar, passed his head through, and saw someone who appeared to him to be a young man rapidly disappearing in the twilight. So we believe that is Eponine, too, kind of calling him out of his daydreams and saying, you need to go to the barricade. That's where your friends are. On page 402 to 405, we learn a little bit more about Monsieur Mabeuf, one of our oldest characters. And he now has to sell his books, his most prized possession, for food. Now, he has sold copies of his books, but these are the originals, his original writing, his original illustrations, and he has to sell them. And it's significant that Hugo has him sell books for food instead of like his clothing or his furniture or the plants themselves. It's, I believe, if you analyze it, that's an idea of people not being able to gain knowledge or education or grow as they might through a book if they're starving. The fact that he has to give up books in order to eat, I think, is significant in that part. So he really is getting to kind of the bottom of his life. Life is not good for Monsieur Mabeuf at this point. He's in a daydream on the bottom of page 404 out in his garden. And it says, in the afternoon, extraordinary sounds broke out in Paris. They resembled musket shots and the clamor of a multitude meaning many people. Father Mabeuf raised his head. He saw a gardener going by and asked, what is that? What's that noise? The gardener answered, his spade, his shovel upon his shoulder, and in the most quiet tone, it's the emuettes. What emuettes? And that word means mobs. It's a French word. It means mobs. And it says they are fighting. What are they fighting for? Oh, Lordy, said the gardener. Like, how do you not know this? Whereabouts? Continued Monsieur Mabeuf. Near the arsenal. Father Mabeuf went into the house, took his hat, looked mechanically for a book to put under his arm, did not find any, said, ah, it is true, and went away with a bewildered air. So he's headed towards the fight that's going to happen in the streets of Paris. There is some discussion in this portion of the book about mobs, about people who get caught up in a cause and then they find themselves in a protest or a riot, and there are people who would not normally do that. But what is it about being in a group and the frenzy that can come from that that changes people into taking action that they wouldn't normally? So there's a lot of discussion here about that mob mentality and how did that play a role in Paris. So our next section on page 405 says June 5th, 1832, and that's a real date in history. And it's actually a day that Hugo lived through. He was living in Paris on the day that this happened. And then later, when he wrote Les Miserables, he put this experience into the book. So you can see here on the top, 1789 is the French Revolution. And by the way, This is what is portrayed on the cover of our book. Those are the riots happening in Paris. It's called the June Rebellion this day. Most people who haven't read the book or who don't understand it think the book is about the French Revolution. We know this is 25 years later. So the French Revolution was in 1789. They went through various rulers. We've talked about all of those. 1832, here's the June Rebellion. So we've already said that cholera, this terrible disease, is making conditions even worse. This man named Lamarck dies. Lamarck was a sympathizer of the poor. So he's a politician and he's not poor, but he looks out for the regular people in France and the poor, and he tries to make life better for them. The problem on this day is that he's died and the monarchy is giving this big funeral for him, and they're kind of taking credit for him, like saying he's one of their own. And that's making all these revolutionaries upset because they feel betrayed by that and angered by that. He was one of their guys. He understood what it was like to be poor in France. And so there's going to be this big procession in the streets with his casket, and people would go line the streets to pay their respects. But on this day, there's so much unrest, it turns into these riots in the city of Paris. 100,000 Parisians, that's one third of the population, took to the streets of Paris in protest. It's an unfair fight. It's regular people versus an entire army, a military force. And the insurgents, the people who rise up, end up losing. Now, just to give you a perspective, here are the populations that would be comparable today if this were to happen in a big city. So a third of San Francisco's population is about 291,000 people. A third of Sacramento is 165,000 people. A third of New York City's population is over 2 million people. So this is not a small event that happened that's in our book. All right, so on page 405. Let's see if I can get out of this. There we go. So we're around number 7 and 8, okay, at this point on these discussion questions. On page 405, this is about that day, the June Rebellion. I'm not going to read through the whole battle scene for you, but I'll pull out a few important parts as we start to see it. So the way that I read this is that the people we know in the book come to the street where they meet, where the restaurant is, and the restaurant is like on this end of the street. And then on both sides, there are apartments or shops, and then it opens out into Paris. And so they're on the end of this dead end street, and they create a barricade and they tip over like a wagon. Um, and they bring out furniture from neighboring shops and homes, and they're piling it all up. And they make this wall between them and the army, and that is called the barricade, and that's what it's named as a place. So everyone we know, the friends of the ABC, all these young men who want to fight, are behind that barricade. About 50 people there behind the barricade. On page 414, it says it was little Gavroche going to war. So Gavroche heads to the barricade. And then on page 415, it was Monsieur Mabeuf. He also is going into the city to the war, and they're all going to end up in this same place. A student asked me today about pages 417. She said 417 through 422 are pretty confusing. Basically, that's what I just boiled down for you in our little slideshow there about why they are going out to fight. So those pages talk about the friends of the ABC, their conversations, what is making them ready to fight at this point, and what is their plan. And so that's just all in preparation of this battle that's going to happen. Now, Gavroche is at the barricade. For one, he doesn't have parents to say, don't go down there, right? There aren't necessarily a lot of kids who are going to be in this position, but no one takes care of him. So that's one reason. And the other reason, as sad as it is that Gavroche doesn't have a lot to lose. He can maybe he's a child and he doesn't understand the risk, but he's a pretty savvy child who's been on the street his whole life. Even if he does understand the risk, he doesn't have a lot to lose. Monsieur Mabeuf, this old man who is essentially starving to death and has sold everything he cares about, he doesn't have a lot to lose. And he's also headed down there. So it's a very uneven fight. On page 430, it's explained to us that this is a fight of 50 insurgents, the people we know, behind this barricade versus 60,000 in the army. Javert, on page 432, ends up at the barricade. He's still a policeman. He's out spying and trying to get information and take it back to the authorities. And so he starts helping out with the barricade where everyone we know is. And eventually, Gavroche is the one who spots him. I believe it's Gavroche, and says, "Hey, that's a police officer." And so then on 432, it says, "You are a spy. I am an officer of the government. Your name is Javert." They take Javert, tie him up in that restaurant. So he's now behind the barricade. You need to know what happens in this battle. Who does what. Not all the friends of the ABC, not all the confusing names, but you should know, what does Gavroche do in the battle? What does Marius do in the battle? He's going to end up there too. What does Monsieur Mabeuf do in the battle? The main characters know what their role is. On page 438, Marius is going to head towards the barricade, partly because that voice through the garden told him to. He felt like it was the voice of destiny. It says he wished to die, the opportunity presented itself. So, again, he feels like he can't get what he wants in life. He can't have Cosette. He did not get permission or money to marry her. So, he might as well go. On page 439, right before the break, it says this whole route, his way to the barricade, resembled a descent down dark stairs. That's foreshadowing. I'm going to skip quite a few pages as this battle ensues. Eponine ends up in the barricade and she plays an important role, so know what she does. The reason she is there is because she brought a letter to Marius. And the letter's contents are on page 455. It's a letter from Cosette. And so Cosette at some point finds Eponine and asks her to take this letter to Marius. It says on the bottom of 455, "My beloved, alas, my father wishes to start immediately. We shall be tonight in the Rue des Hommes Armés, number 7. In a week, we shall be in England. Cosette, June 4th. So Jean Valjean is making a major move, not just from one part of Paris to the other. For all the reasons we've discussed, he is going to move then to England. So now Marius really feels this is impossible. On page 456, he writes a note back and he gives it to Gavroche. He gives it to Gavroche for two reasons. One, he really wants the letter to reach Cosette. Two, it's a ploy to get Gavroche out of the battle, to distract him, because this boy will not leave just because you tell him to. But if you give him a job to do, he'll go do that. And so he wants this child. It's a very ugly battle. He wants this child to get out of um, sorry, he wants this child to get out of the battle. We let that ring. What? Okay, hold on. I'm recording. It's okay.